On the 30th of December 1903, nearly 1,700 people packed into Chicago's newest theatre. The theatre was advertised as modern, luxurious, and in particular it was advertised as being completely safe. In fact, newspapers and promotional materials described it as something extraordinary. A theatre so advanced it was said to be completely fireproof. But shortly after 3 o'clock that afternoon, a small flame appeared high above the stage. At first it seemed insignificant. The actors continued performing. The audience remained seated. Few people realized that they were witnessing the beginning of one of the deadliest disasters in American history. Within minutes, hundreds of people would be trapped, exits would fail, smoke would fill the building, and panic would spread throughout the crowded auditorium. By the end of the day, around 602 people would be dead. Not because of a single fire, but because nearly every safety system designed to protect them failed. This is a story of the Iroquois Theatre Fire, a disaster that changed public safety forever. History remembers the tragedies, but often forgets the warnings. This is Bone Gavel, where history turns dark. In 1903, Chicago was one of the fastest growing cities in the world. Factories lined the streets, railroads connected the city to the rest of America, and millions of dollars flowed through the businesses. New buildings seemed to appear almost every night, yet Chicago carried a painful memory. 32 years earlier, the city had suffered one of the most infamous disasters in American history, the Great Chicago Fire of 1871. Beginning on the 8th of October 1871, the fire consumed thousands of buildings. Entire neighborhoods vanished. More than 17,000 structures were completely destroyed. Around 100,000 people were left homeless. The disaster reshaped the city forever. And afterward, Chicago became obsessed with fire prevention. New building codes were introduced. Architects sought safer designs. Fire departments were improving their equipment and their training, and city officials promised that lessons had been learned. By the beginning of the 20th century, many citizens believed that Chicago had become a leader in modern fire safety. The city prided itself on progress, innovation, and engineering, but as the Iroquois Theatre would soon demonstrate, believing a building is safe and ensuring that it's safe are two very different things. In 1903, the Iroquois Theatre opened in downtown Chicago, located at 2428 West Randolph Street. It occupied valuable real estate in the heart of the city. The theatre was intended to be spectacular, and the owners wanted it to rival the finest theatres in America. Construction reportedly cost around $500,000, an enormous sum for the era. Everything about the building was designed to impress. The auditorium featured lavish decorations, rich fabrics, elegant plasterwork, beautiful balconies, and seating for more than 1,600 people. Some reports suggest that the building could hold even more when standing rooms were being used. The theatre represented wealth, modernity, and prestige. For Chicago's growing middle class, attending a performance at the Iroquois was a fashionable experience. Yet behind all of this luxury and decoration, problems already existed. Some portions of construction had been completely rushed. Work was still being completed shortly before opening, and despite the building's reputation, Certain safety features were incomplete or very questionable right from the very beginning. These issues would later become critically important. Perhaps the most shocking fact about the entire disaster was the theatre's reputation before the fire. The Iroquois was widely promoted as being exceptionally safe. Advertisements and public statements repeatedly emphasized its fire-resistant design. Many people came to believe that the building was effectively fireproof. For audiences living only a generation after the Great Chicago Fire, such claims were reassuring. Parents felt comfortable bringing their children. Families viewed the theatre as a safe destination, and city officials appeared satisfied with the building's credentials. But beneath those assurances, danger remained. Theatre fires were not uncommon during this time. Stages used enormous quantities of scenery made from highly flammable materials. Painted canvas backdrops, wooden structures, fabric curtains, and early electrical systems capable of producing sparks. Because of these risks, modern theatres rely on multiple layers of protection. But the Iroquois, several of those protections either didn't exist or would later completely fail when they were needed. The tragedy was not simply a fire that started. The tragedy was that people believed that they were protected, when in reality, they weren't. The featured production at the Iroquois Theatre was a musical comedy called Mr. Bluebeard. Today, the name may sound strange, but in 1903 it was a popular holiday attraction. The production combined comedy, music, dance, special effects, and elaborate stage scenery. It was exactly the type of spectacle that audiences loved. One of its stars was Eddie Foy. He was a well-known comedian and performer. Foy would later become one of the central figures in survivor accounts. On December the 30th, the theatre was packed. School holidays were underway and families were looking for entertainment. Many children attended the matinee. The atmosphere was festive, it was fun, it was exciting, and nobody in the audience suspected that they would be walking in to a night that would make history. In the weeks leading up to the fire, several safety concerns had already been raised. Some exits were difficult to see, curtain doors were unfamiliar to patrons, emergency procedures were limited, and crucially, not all safety systems had been fully tested under emergency conditions. The theatre possessed a fire curtain designed to separate the stage from the audience. If a fire started backstage, the curtain should have descended and sealed the opening, preventing flames and smoke from entering the auditorium. It was one of the most important safety features in the building, but there was a big problem. Evidence suggested that the curtain just couldn't function properly, whether it was because of lighting equipment or construction flaws. The result would be catastrophic. Even more concerning were the smoke vents above the stage. These vents existed for a simple reason: hot air rises. During a fire, vents would open automatically, allowing heat and smoke to escape upwards. Instead, when the disaster started, they failed to perform as intended, and that failure would turn a stage fire into a mass casualty. As afternoon approached, people began arriving at the theatre. They purchased tickets, they found their seats, they read their programmes, and they settled in, ready for a performance. By around 3 p.m, the building was crowded. The show was underway and the actors were performing on stage. Everything appeared normal, everything appeared safe. And then, at about 3:15 p.m, a spark ignited a piece of scenery high above the stage. A small flame appeared. Few people noticed, but history had just changed forever. Like many productions of the era, Mr. Bluebeard relied heavily on visual spectacle. There were large painted backdrops that hung above the stage, fabric scenery filled the wings, and decorative draperies framed the performers. Much of it was beautiful, but much of it was also highly flammable. The audience, however, had very little reason to think about these things. They were focused on the show, the children were laughing at the jokes, and parents were sat and relaxed. The atmosphere remained cheerful. Then a stage light malfunctioned. The likely source of the fire was an arc light. These lights were commonly used in theatres during the early 20th century. They produced intense illuminations by creating an electrical arc between carbon rods. The technology was effective. It was also capable of producing sparks. At some point during the performance, one of these sparks appeared to have ignited a piece of scenery hanging above the stage. The material involved was probably muslin, a lightweight cotton fabric frequently used for painted theatre backdrops. Muslin had many advantages. It was inexpensive, it was easy to paint, it was easy to move. Unfortunately, it also burned rapidly. When the spark landed, a small flame began to spread across the fabric. Initially, the fire occupied a relatively limited section. Stage fires weren't unheard of. Many theatres kept equipment intended to deal with exactly this type of situation. Had everything functioned properly, the story of the Iroquois Theatre might have ended very differently. Members of the stage crew noticed the flames quickly, and several rushed to respond. One attempt involved the use of a fire extinguisher. Accounts suggest that it failed to operate properly. Others tried using a so-called fire hooks to pull the burning scenery away from the surrounding materials. This was a common firefighting technique in the theatre at the time. The goal was simple: remove the burning material before the flames spread. Now, unfortunately, the situation was already becoming too dangerous. The fire had started high above the stage. Heat naturally rises. As the flames climbed through the hanging scenery, they began to reach other combustive materials. Every second mattered. The crew fought to contain the fire, but the fire was beginning to move faster than they could react. Now, as we mentioned, one of the people on the stage that afternoon was Eddie Foy. Unlike many performers, Foy quickly grasped the seriousness of this situation. At first, some audience members assumed that all of this commotion was part of the act. The production featured elaborate effects, and unexpected activity backstage wasn't really unusual. But Foy attempted to reassure the crowd. He stepped forward and addressed them directly. His calmness may have prevented an immediate panic. For a brief moment, it appeared possible that the audience could leave in an orderly fashion. Yet events backstage were moving far more quickly than those people in the auditorium realized. The danger was no longer to a patch of burning fabrics. It was about to interact with the building itself, and that was where the disaster truly began. The Iroquois Theatre possessed what should have been its most important safety feature: a fire curtain. The enormous barrier was designed to separate the stage from the audience. The principle was straightforward. If a fire broke out backstage, the fire curtain would be lowered and create a huge barrier. The smoke and flames would continue on one side, and the audience would be able to evacuate in an orderly fashion on the other side. Across the theatre industry, fire curtains were considered essential. When the order was given to lower the curtain at the Iroquois, something went wrong. The curtain failed to seal the opening. Now, historical accounts differ on the precise reason for this. Some suggested that light fixtures obstructed the curtain's path. Others said that there were design flaws or operational problems with the curtain. Regardless of the exact reason, the outcome was devastating. Instead of creating a barrier, gaps still remained. The stage and the auditorium were still connected. Heat, smoke, and fire now had a route into the auditorium. The audience didn't fully understand what was happening. Many people could see flames. Few could appreciate how quickly the situation was deteriorating. Now, the next failure was even more consequential. Above the stage were the smoke vents. Their purpose was to release heat and smoke and combustible gases upwards. In functioning theatre, these vents were like a chimney. Hot air escaped through the roof rather than into the audience. At the Iroquois, the vents didn't function as they were intended. Some evidence suggests that they were partially stuck. Other accounts indicate that they were never fully opened. What matters is the result. The fire continued generating enormous heat, and that heat had nowhere to go. At the same time, doors throughout the building were being opened as people began attempting to leave. This created a powerful draft. Air rushed through the theatre. The flames suddenly intensified, and witnesses later described what happened next in terrifying terms. The stage erupted into an enormous blast of heat and fire. A superheated wave surged outward from the stage opening and into the auditorium. Modern investigators sometimes compare the effect to opening the door of a furnace. In only a few moments, conditions changed from dangerous to catastrophic. Those closest to the stage were among the first to understand the immense danger. People rose from their seats, some began moving towards the exits, others called to their family members, parents were grabbing their children, and friends searched for their companions. The atmosphere changed instantly. What had been a holiday performance was becoming an emergency. Yet many audience members still believed that they had plenty of time. They assumed that they could simply stand, walk out, and return home. What they didn't know was that several of the theatre's most critical safety weaknesses were about to reveal themselves, and those weaknesses would transform a fire into one of the deadliest public disasters in American history. Now the fire had spread beyond the stage, and the protective systems had failed. Thousands of people were now trying to leave the building that had promised them safety. The next 15 minutes would determine the fate of hundreds of people. At first, the audience reacted as many people do in emergency situations. Many stood up to get a better view. Some hesitated, others waited to see what other people around them were doing. Psychologists now refer to this as normalcy bias. People naturally assume that a dangerous situation will somehow remain manageable. In 1903, nobody had studied crowd behaviour in the way that we have done today. But eyewitness accounts reveal the same pattern. Many patrons didn't immediately run. Instead, they watched, they listened, and they tried to understand what was happening. Unfortunately, the fire was developing faster than the crowd could process it. Within moments, smoke became visible, heat intensified, and certainty gave way to fear. On stage, Eddie Foy continued trying to maintain order. Several accounts describe him urging calm. His presence may have prevented an immediate stampede near the orchestra level. Even years later, survivors remembered his efforts. Yet, no performer, no matter how experienced, could overcome what was happening elsewhere in the building. People seated further from the stage could not always hear instructions very clearly. Others could already see smoke moving across the auditorium ceiling. As conditions worsened, individual decision-making gave way to instinct, and the audience stopped watching the performance and they started looking for exits. Now, this is where the design of the theatre became deadly and had a huge impact on the death toll in this disaster. Modern audiences are accustomed to illuminated exit signs, emergency lighting, clearly marked routes, doors that swing outwards, and regular inspections. But in 1903, many of these standards either did not exist or they were poorly enforced. The Iroquois contained numerous exits on paper. The problem was that not all of them functioned effectively under emergency situations. Some doors were completely concealed behind draperies, and others were just unfamiliar to patrons. Several required specific knowledge to operate properly. As panic spread, people naturally headed towards entrances that they already knew. This concentrated hundreds of people into a small number of escape routes. Within minutes, bottlenecks began forming. And bottlenecks become deadly when thousands of frightening people are moving all at once. The greatest loss of life occurred in the upper levels of the theatre. The balcony and gallery sections were packed. Many seats had been sold to working class families seeking affordable holiday entertainment. From these upper levels, escape depended on narrow stairways and limited routes downwards. As smoke and heat increased, hundreds of people moved simultaneously towards those exits. The flow quickly slowed, then it stopped. Those at the front encountered obstacles. Those behind had no idea why the movement had ceased. They continued pushing forwards. Pressure increased, and rows collapsed into one another. People lost their footing. Once individuals fell over, others stumbled over them. The stairways became blocked, and as more people arrived from behind, the weight of the crowd intensified. Modern crown disaster research has shown that fatal crushes often occur not because people are deliberately trampling on one another. Rather, the sheer force generated by hundreds of bodies moving together becomes so overwhelming. The Iroquois Theatre would become one of the earliest and most tragic examples of this phenomenon. While crowding worsened throughout the theatre, another threat was spreading rapidly: smoke. Many victims never reached the flames. Many never even saw them. Instead, they encountered dense smoke filling corridors and stairwells. Smoke from structural fires contains toxic gases, reduced oxygen levels, and airborne particles that impair vision. Within minutes, escape routes became increasingly difficult to navigate. People struggled to see, and families became separated. Children disappeared in the confusion. Witnesses later described scenes of near total darkness in certain areas. Those trapped inside had no way of knowing which route remained open. Every second, the danger is increasing, and every breath was becoming harder. Every single delay made survival less likely. At ground level, some patrons successfully reached exits to Randolph Street. Here, the situation remained chaotic but survivable. Those who escaped often described turning back and seeing waves of people still emerging from the theatre. Others immediately began trying to help. Chicago citizens rushed towards the building. Police officers arrived. and passers-by joined in the efforts without hesitation. Ladders were brought forward and windows were being smashed. Strangers worked together in desperate attempts to pull people to safety. Acts of courage were appearing throughout this disaster. There were firefighters, theatre employees, ordinary members of the public. Many were risking their lives to save the lives of others. Some succeeded, and others never returned. One of the most devastating findings to emerge after the disaster involved the fire escapes. The very structures intended to provide alternative routes out of the building proved inadequate. Some were difficult to access, others became overcrowded. Several eyewitnesses reported terrifying scenes as desperate people attempted to descend from the elevated exits. In some locations, structural failures occurred. Elsewhere, the sheer number of people attempting to use the same escape routes created impossible conditions. The result was that many who reached a fire escape discovered that they were still not safe. For a building advertised as a model of modern safety, the reality was becoming painfully clear. Redundancy had failed, backup systems had failed, and hundreds remained trapped. Chicago firefighters responded rapidly. The city's fire service was among the most experienced in the nation. The memory of 1871 remained embedded in people's minds. Fire crews arrived expecting to battle a dangerous blaze. What they encountered was far worse. Outside the theatre, survivors poured into the streets. Inside, rescue operations began immediately. Firefighters forced entry into the blocked areas. They carried victims from stairwells, they searched smoke-filled corridors, and they confronted scenes that few would ever forget. The challenge was no longer extinguishing a fire. The challenge was recovering people from a building that had become a maze of blocked exits, smoke-filled passageways, and collapsed human traffic. The gallery suffered some of the highest tragedies. When rescuers eventually reached the certain stairways and exits, they discovered enormous piles of victims. Some had succumbed to smoke inhalation, others had been trapped by crowd pressure. Many were found only a short distance from the exits. This became one of the defining tragedies of the Iroquois disaster. A significant number of victims had done exactly what they were supposed to do. They moved towards exits, they followed escape routes, they attempted to leave, yet flaws in the building itself turned those routes into deadly bottlenecks. The disaster was not simply the result of a fire. It was a result of a system that failed at every single critical moment. As the afternoon progressed, news spread throughout Chicago. At first, reports were confused. Some believed only a handful of people had been injured. Others assumed the fire had been quickly contained. The truth emerged gradually. Ambulances moved continuously between the theatre and hospitals. Families were searching for their loved ones, and crowds gathered outside medical centres. Police stations received inquiries from desperate relatives. By the evening time, city officials realised the scale of what had happened. The Iroquois Theatre disaster was no ordinary fire. It was a mass casualty catastrophe, unlike anything Chicago had experienced since the Great Fire, and the full human cost had not yet been counted. The flames were being extinguished, the crowds had dispersed, but inside the theatre, the hardest work was only the beginning. Rescuers now faced the grim task of recovering the dead. Hospitals were completely overwhelmed, and families were searching desperately for missing relatives. investigators began to ask questions that would echo across America. How could a building advertised as fireproof become the site of one of the deadliest public disasters in history? As survivors poured into the streets, the injured were transported to hospitals across Chicago. Ambulances moved continuously between the theatre district and the medical facilities. Police wagons were pressed into service. Private carriages carried victims. Even ordinary citizens used whatever transportation was available. Some people were being transported on coal wagons. Doctors quickly realized that they were facing an unprecedented emergency. Many victims suffered major burns, others had broken bones, and many more had inhaled large quantities of smoke and toxic gases. Medical staff were working without any breaks, and the corridors became overcrowded. Waiting rooms were overflowing. Some hospitals established temporary treatment areas to cope with the numbers of people that were arriving. Throughout the city, word spread. Families rushed to hospitals hoping to locate relatives. Some found them alive. Others arrived only to discover that their loved ones had already been taken elsewhere. The confusion was immense, and this confusion would continue for days. Early reports underestimated the disaster. Many newspapers initially believed the death toll would be relatively low. That assumption did not last long. As recovery teams entered the theatre and hospitals submitted casualty lists, its numbers continued to grow. Dozens became hundreds. What had appeared to be a serious accident was revealed as a catastrophe of historic proportions. By evening editions, newspaper headlines across Chicago carried shocking news. The city's newest theatre had become the site of one of the worst disasters in American history. Journalists were describing the scenes of devastation, and witnesses recounted desperate attempts to escape. Survivors told stories of a smoke-filled stairway and a blocked exit. Readers struggled to comprehend the scale of this tragedy. The victims were not distant strangers. They were teachers, clerks, factory workers, children, and entire families. Many Chicago residents knew somebody who had attended the theatre production, and many spent the evening waiting for news that never came. Inside the theatre, recovery efforts would continue long after the flames were extinguished. Firefighters and police officers moved carefully through the building. The conditions were grim. Smoke still lingered, and debris covered many areas. And throughout the structure, victims remained where they had fallen. The gallery and balcony sections proved especially heartbreaking. Rescuers discovered large numbers of people near exits and stairways. Some had been only a short distance from safety. This was a sight that deeply affected even experienced firefighters and officers. Many later described the scene as one of the worst things that they've ever encountered. As bodies were removed, they were transported to temporary morgues established throughout the city. Officials faced an enormous identification effort. Hundreds of families were searching for missing relatives, and many victims carried no identification. Children were especially difficult to identify. This process would take days. For some families, much longer. Statistics tell part of this story, but statistics alone cannot convey the reality of what had happened. Among the dead were entire families, parents who had brought their children to a holiday show, brothers and sisters seated together, friends enjoying an afternoon performance. People from different neighbourhoods, different occupations, different backgrounds, all gathered for the same purpose, an afternoon of entertainment and fun. Many of these victims were women and children, and this fact later became especially significant in newspaper coverage. Images of small coffins and grieving families appeared across the country. The disaster struck a powerful emotional chord because it occurred in a place associated with leisure and happiness. A theatre was supposed to be safe. A holiday performance was supposed to be enjoyable and exciting. Instead, it became a national tragedy. Survivors provided investigators with crucial information. Many accounts shared common themes. People described difficulty locating exits. Others recalled confusion caused by inadequate signage. Several survivors remembered encountering doors that were difficult to open under pressure. Many reported that smoke spread rapidly throughout the building, and witnesses also described the speed in which the conditions deteriorated. What began as visible flames on stage became a life-threatening emergency within minutes. Some survivors recall helping strangers escape. Others spoke of becoming separated from their family members. And many never forgot the sounds, the cries for help, the confusion, the desperate attempts to find a way out. These testimonies would later prove essential because they helped investigators reconstruct exactly how the disaster unfolded. Almost immediately, public attention shifted to accountability. People wanted answers. How could a modern theatre suffer such a catastrophic failure? And why had so many exits proved ineffective? Had a safety system failed? And perhaps most importantly, why had the building been advertised as fireproof? Investigators began examining construction records, inspection reports, architectural plans, witness statements, and the theatre itself. What they discovered was deeply troubling. The fire had not been caused by one single mistake. Instead, it appeared to result from multiple failures occurring simultaneously. A dangerous combination of design flaws, inadequate safeguards, and poor emergency preparedness. Each failure amplified the next. Together, they created a disaster far larger than the initial fire itself. Particular attention focused on the theatre's exits. Investigators learned that having exits on paper was not the same as having exits that worked during an emergency. Some routes were difficult to locate. Others became bottlenecks almost immediately. Several doors and passageways proved incapable of handling the volume of people that were attempting to escape. In modern safety engineering, crowd movement is studied extensively. In 1903, those principles were poorly understood. The Iroquois disaster demonstrated the consequence. When hundreds of people move towards a limited number of exits simultaneously, even small obstacles can produce deadly results. This lesson would have enormous influence on future building regulations, but that influence came too late for those trapped inside the Iroquois Theatre. Investigators also examined the stage safety features. The fire curtain attracted particular attention. It had been intended as the primary barrier between the stage and the audience, yet it had failed to perform its intended function. Questions arose regarding its design, its installation, and whether it had been properly tested. The smoke vents above the stage came under scrutiny as well. Had they opened correctly, much of the heat and smoke will have escaped upwards. Instead, dangerous conditions developed throughout the auditorium. Experts increasingly concluded that the fire itself was only part of the problem. The greater issue was the failure of the protective systems designed to contain it. A small stage fire should not have produced hundreds of deaths. The fact that it did suggested deeper problems within the building. As more and more details emerged, public anger grew. Citizens questioned the theatre owners, inspectors, the architects, and the city officials. Many felt betrayed by the repeated assurance of safety. The phrase "fireproof theatre" became a source of bitter criticism. Newspapers demanded accountability, and editorials called for reform. Questions were being raised about inspection practices and building standards throughout Chicago. The disaster had exposed weaknesses that extended far beyond a single theatre. If these failures could occur at the Iroquois, where else might they exist? That question would soon drive one of the most significant safety reform movements in American history. In early January 1904, Chicago was in mourning. Hundreds had died, hospitals remained crowded, and families were still identifying their loved ones. Investigators had uncovered a series of failures that transformed a relatively small fire into one of the most deadliest public disasters in American history. Now came the question that everyone was asking: who was responsible? Public anger was immediate and intense. The disaster had occurred in a building that had been promoted as safe, modern, state-of-the-art. Many Chicago residents felt that they'd been deceived. Attention quickly turned towards several groups: the theatre owners, the architects, the construction contractors, and the city inspectors, and public officials responsible for approving the building. Newspapers demanded answers. Editorial writers asked how a theatre with known deficiencies had been allowed to operate. Citizens wanted more than explanations. They wanted accountability. Yet determining exactly who was responsible proved more difficult than many people expected. One of the first major investigations came through the coroner's inquest. Witnesses were called and survivors testified. Theatre employees described conditions inside the building, and experts were examining the construction details and the safety systems. The hearing attracted enormous public interest. As testimonies accumulated, a troubling picture emerged. Evidence suggests that safety features had been inadequate. Some requirements may not have been fully met. Certain systems had failed completely, exactly when they were needed the most. Questions arose about inspections, questions arose about enforcement, and questions arose about whether commercial interests had been placed ahead of public safety. For many observers, the evidence seemed overwhelming. Surely, someone would face serious consequences. But events would not unfold as expected. Following the disaster, numerous lawsuits were filed. Families sought compensation for lost loved ones. Survivors pursued claims for injuries. The theatre company found itself at the centre of a growing legal storm. Court proceedings continued on for years. Attorneys argued over liability, responsibility, and negligence. Yet despite the scale of the tragedy, the legal outcomes left many dissatisfied. Some settlements were reached. Financial compensation was paid in certain cases, but many people felt that justice had fallen short. No major figure served significant jail time for the disaster. No sweeping criminal accountability followed, and for grieving families, this was difficult to accept. More than 600 people had died, yet the legal system appeared unable or unwilling to impose punishments matching the scale of the loss. The Iroquois Theatre itself became a symbol of failure. Public confidence in the building disappeared. Authorities ordered extensive modification. Safety deficiencies had to be addressed. Exits were redesigned and protective systems were improved. Construction changes were implemented, and eventually the building reopened under a different name. But the original identity of the theatre was permanently damaged. For Chicago residents, the location would forever be associated with the events of December the 30th, 1903. No renovation could erase that memory, and no new name could remove the history. The building had become a monument to a preventable disaster. Now, although many people felt that justice was incomplete, the disaster produced something else entirely: reform. And that reform would save countless lives. Building codes across America began changing. Cities reviewed theatre regulations, and fire safety standards were strengthened. Architects reconsidered how public buildings were being designed. The lessons of the Iroquois Theatre spread far beyond Chicago. Officials recognized the critical truth that safety systems are completely useless if they fail during an emergency. Every protective measure had to function under the worst possible conditions, not just during an inspection, not just on paper, but during a real crisis. That principle remains fundamental to modern safety engineering. Today, when you enter a theatre, a stadium, a concert venue, a cinema, a school, you'll notice something most people never think about. Exit doors now typically open outward. The reason is simple. During an emergency, crowds naturally push towards exits. If a door opens inward, the pressure of the crowd can prevent it from opening. The Iroquois disaster demonstrated how deadly that problem could be. In the years that followed, regulations increasingly required outward opening exit doors in public buildings. Now, this seems like such a small detail, but it has saved countless lives, and it exists because of tragedies like the one in Chicago. Many modern safety features owe part of their development to lessons learned from the Iroquois fire. Clearly visible exit signs, emergency lighting systems, improved crowd management, occupancy regulations, regular fire inspections. These measures emerged through decades of reform influenced by multiple disasters. The Iroquois Theatre played a significant role in accelerating that process. Investigators discovered that people often could not locate exits quick enough. Others became trapped when familiar routes failed. The solution was not merely adding more exits. The solution was making them visible, accessible, and immediately understandable during moments of panic. Even today, building designers continue applying those same principles. The disaster also transformed theatre design itself. Fire curtains became more rigorously regulated, stage ventilation systems improved, emergency procedures became more sophisticated, and regular safety testing became increasingly important. The entertainment industry recognized that stages present unique risks. Large quantities of scenery, electrical equipment, lighting systems, and special effects all created potential safety hazards. Modern theatres contain multiple layers of protection, designed to prevent a single incident from escalating into a catastrophe. Those protections exist because previous generations learned difficult lessons, and few lessons were more influential than those learned at the Iroquois Theatre. Now, although the fire occurred in Chicago, the influence extended beyond the United States. Engineers, architects, fire departments, and government officials all around the world studied the disaster. The findings contributed to a broader conversation about public safety. Many countries strengthened their regulations governing theatres and assembly halls. The fire became a case study, a warning, and a reminder that assumptions about safety must always be tested. And history shows that disasters often produce change. But the most meaningful changes occur when lessons are remembered. The victims of the Iroquois Theatre helped shape standards that continue protecting people more than a century later. Now, when discussing disasters, it's easy to focus on the buildings, the regulations, engineering and investigations, but at the centre of the tragedy are people, the men, the women, and the children who never returned home. The families who spent New Year's Eve arranging funerals rather than celebrating. The survivors who carried memories of that afternoon for the rest of their lives. The victims of the Iroquois Theatre Fire are often remembered through statistics. 602 people died. Around 250 were injured. Yet each number represents a person, a life, a family, and a future that ended inside a theatre that had promised safety. That is the true legacy of this disaster, not merely just the laws that followed, but the people whose deaths forced society to confront uncomfortable truths. The fire at the Iroquois Theatre lasted minutes. Its consequences have lasted generations. Today, millions of people attend concerts, watch films, visit theatres, and gather in public venues by safety measures they rarely even notice. Exit signs, emergency lighting, outward opening doors, occupancy limits, fire curtains, inspection requirements. Most people never think about why those protections exist, but behind each one lies a story, and behind many of those stories lies a tragedy. The Iroquois Theatre Fire was not the deadliest fire in history, but it remains one of the most important, because it revealed how quickly confidence can become catastrophe when safety exists only in theory. More than 120 years later, the lessons remain relevant. Promises are not protection, labels are not guarantees, and true safety is measured not by what works during the ordinary days, but by what works when everything goes wrong. Until next time, this has been Bone Gavel, where history turns dark. If you want more forgotten disasters, historical true crime, and dark stories that people don't really talk about, please subscribe to Bone Gavel. And if there's anything that you want me to cover, please let me know down in the comments.